Imagine a quiet village tucked away in the northern countryside of France. Its name almost poetic, Le Paradis, the paradise. The bird song blends with the wind swaying the wheat fields. Children play by stone fences. Church bells echo softly through the morning mist. But then a question breaks through the serenity. What could possibly turn a place called paradise into hell on earth? The answer begins in May 1940, as the Battle of France reached its most violent stage. The German war machine, the Wehrmacht, supported by elite Nazi formations, had torn through Belgium and the Low Countries like a storm. The British Expeditionary Force, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, began a desperate retreat north toward the coast. One of their final lines of resistance was a group of exhausted British soldiers from the Royal Norfolk Regiment. Cornered, cut off, and running low on ammunition, they dug in around the village of Le Paradis, determined to hold the line as long as they could. But what they didn't know was this. Coming for them wasn't just the regular German army. It was something far more ruthless. From the east marched the SS Totenkopf Division, a name that meant Death's Head. These were not ordinary soldiers. Many had once been guards at Nazi concentration camps. Now they were unleashed onto the battlefield, carrying with them not just weapons, but an ideology of hatred. Their commander was SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Knoechlein, a man loyal not to the rules of war, but to the twisted vision of Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler. As the two forces clashed in the fields surrounding Le Paradis, a bloody stand began. The British held on as long as they could. Then, outgunned and surrounded, they surrendered, expecting at the very least to be taken as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. But that assumption would prove tragically naive, because the men they surrendered to had been trained not to show mercy. And what happened next, in a quiet field behind a red-bricked farmhouse, would become one of the most chilling war crimes of the Second World War. What really happened to those British soldiers who laid down their weapons in Le Paradis? And why did a group of SS men already hardened by cruelty, choose to open fire on the unarmed? That's where our story begins. The men of the Royal Norfolk Regiment were not elite soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, clerks, ordinary men in khaki, called to defend their homeland from a force that seemed unstoppable. By late May 1940, their numbers had dwindled. Cut off from reinforcements, low on ammunition, and physically shattered after days of marching and fighting, they dug in around a cluster of buildings just outside Le Paradis, a place known as Duryea Farm. Inside its battered walls were two platoons, roughly 99 men, armed with just a few rifles and a single Bren gun. Their orders were simple but grim. Hold the line as long as possible, buy time for others to retreat toward Dunkirk. Outside, the thunder of artillery drew closer. German tanks advanced with relentless precision. And then, on the morning of May 27, 1940, the SS Totenkopf Division arrived. What followed was a ferocious exchange of fire. The British held the farm for hours, picking off German troops from windows and hedgerows. But by mid-afternoon, their position was no longer tenable. Ammunition gone, wounded men bleeding on the floor, walls collapsing. The order was given: surrender. The British troops, exhausted and unarmed, stepped out of the ruins with their hands raised. They had done their duty. They expected to be treated as prisoners of war. But waiting for them was a different kind of enemy. Fritz Knoechlein, a man made for war, their captor, was SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Knoechlein, a man in his early 30s with a clean uniform and a reputation for discipline and brutality. Born in Munich, Knoechlein joined the Nazi Party early and quickly found his place in the Schutzstaffel, the SS. He rose through the ranks not because of compassion or strategy, but because of ideological purity. He was a believer, a man who had memorized Mein Kampf like scripture. Knoechlein was a product of the SS machine. For years, he had commanded guards at concentration camps. To him, mercy was a weakness. Sympathy was treason. His orders were not to think, but to obey. And the Geneva Convention? That was a luxury reserved for civilized enemies. To Knoechlein, these surrendered British soldiers were not equals. They were obstacles, and obstacles in war are to be removed. Totenkopf Division, from camp guards to killing machines. The SS Totenkopf Division, literally Death's Head Division, was forged in a place without rules, the Nazi concentration camp system. Many of its men had begun their careers not as soldiers, but as executioners, carrying out the day-to-day horrors at places like Dachau and Sachsenhausen. When war broke out, Heinrich Himmler saw an opportunity: unleash them on the battlefield. Their cruelty would be an asset. These were men trained not to question, not to feel, only to destroy. Indoctrinated with the belief that enemies of Germany, especially those from the West, were subhuman, they viewed surrender as cowardice, not a right. So when the British soldiers stepped out from Durier's farm, they were not met with pity, they were met with loathing. A letter that never reached home. Among the fallen was Private James Atkins, a 20-year-old from Norfolk. Days before the massacre, he had written a letter home to his mother. "Mum, if this is the last time I get to write, know that I'm proud. I'm not scared, just tired. The lads are holding strong. I hope the garden is blooming." The letter never made it home. It was found years later in the mud of a French field, stained with blood and soot. James, like so many others, never got to see England again, but his words remain, a quiet echo of humanity, just before the darkness fell. The afternoon sun beat down over the quiet fields behind Durier's farm. Under normal circumstances, the sound here would have been birdsong, the rustling of wheat, and the occasional bark of a village dog. But on May 27, 1940, it was the sound of boots. German boots. 99 British soldiers, disarmed, wounded, and exhausted, were marched out of the ruins of the farmhouse. Their uniforms were torn, faces smeared with blood and ash. Some limped. Others leaned on comrades for support. They had surrendered under the belief that they would be treated according to the rules of war. They were wrong. In the nearby field, they were ordered to line up against a brick wall, an old barnyard wall, chipped and sunbaked. There was no interpreter, no charges, no warning. Then came the voice of Fritz Knoechlein. A single word. Cold. Final. Feuer. The SS machine guns opened up. What followed was not war. It was execution. Men fell in waves, clutching at their chests, collapsing onto the bodies of their comrades. Some tried to crawl. Others stood in shock until the bullets found them too. The wall turned red, then black. Smoke drifted through the summer air. And then, silence. I heard screaming, one local French farmer later recalled. Then nothing. Nothing but wind. The ground looked as if it had been painted in blood. Two men who refused to die amid the lifeless heap of bodies. Two men were not dead. Private Albert Pooley had been hit in the leg. As he fell, he was buried beneath the bodies of his comrades. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Beside him, Private William O'Callaghan did the same, playing dead as SS soldiers walked among the bodies, firing occasional rounds into the corpses to make sure no one was left alive. When night came and the killers had left, the two men crawled from the pile of the dead, their uniforms soaked in blood, some of it not their own. With shattered limbs and barely enough strength to move, they dragged themselves through the fields toward the village of Le Paradis. There, a French family risked their lives to hide the two survivors, treating their wounds and shielding them from German patrols until they were eventually discovered and taken as POWs. Their survival was a miracle. Their story would be dismissed for years as too horrific to be true. Witnesses in the shadows. Though the SS tried to erase all traces of the massacre, they couldn't erase the memories of the French villagers who watched in horror from behind shutters and fence posts. One woman later told investigators, "I remember the cries, then a terrible silence. When we walked the field days later, there were crows circling. The smell of blood was everywhere, and the wall was soaked with it." The massacre was swift. It was methodical, and worst of all, it was premeditated. These men had laid down their arms. They were no longer combatants, but to Fritz Knoechlein and the SS Totenkopf Division, they were still the enemy, deserving of death. In the days following the massacre, Le Paradis became a village frozen in fear. The fields were eerily quiet. The barnyard wall stood stained, riddled with bullets. Crows circled above, as if guarding a terrible secret. Villagers avoided the sight. Mothers held their children close. No one dared speak aloud of what they had seen. The SS Totenkopf Division still roamed nearby, and any whisper of defiance could mean death. But in one farmhouse, hidden from prying eyes, two British soldiers, Albert Pooley and William O'Callaghan, were fighting for their lives. Their legs shattered, bodies broken. They were tended to by a brave French family who risked execution for hiding them. Bandages made from torn curtains. Water passed in silence. Eventually, the inevitable happened. A German patrol found them. But by then, their captors saw them only as anonymous prisoners of war. Pooley and O'Callaghan were sent to a POW camp, surviving the rest of the war behind barbed wire. Their scars, a constant reminder of what they'd escaped. A story no one wanted to hear. When the war ended in 1945, Pooley returned to England. But instead of celebration, he carried a burden, a story no one believed. He told officials what had happened at Le Paradis: the surrender, the execution, the mass grave. But their reaction? Skepticism. Are you sure they weren't killed in battle? Perhaps it was crossfire. It's a terrible tale, but unverifiable. For years, the massacre at Le Paradis remained a rumor, a whisper behind closed doors. The idea that uniformed German officers could execute surrendered prisoners in cold blood was, at the time, too unthinkable for many to accept. Even in a world reeling from the horrors of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, some still clung to the myth of honorable combat, a truth that refused to stay buried. But Pooley didn't give up. He wrote letters, gave testimony, kept telling the same story over and over, and eventually someone listened. War crimes investigators, combing through German records and testimonies, began to piece together the event. French villagers came forward, confirming the screams, the blood, the bullet-riddled wall. Survivors from the SS unit were interrogated. Fritz Knoechlein's name surfaced again and again. The truth became undeniable. What happened at Le Paradis wasn't a battlefield tragedy. It was a war crime, a deliberate, calculated act of mass murder. When this truth reached the British public, the reaction was swift and furious. Newspapers screamed headlines like, "This was not war, this was slaughter." SS executioner, named in Norfolk Massacre. For the families of the 97 murdered soldiers, the grief turned to outrage, and for Fritz Knoechlein, justice was coming. In 1948, 8 years after the massacre at Le Paradis, a military tribunal was convened in Hamburg, Germany. Seated in the dock was the man whose voice had once echoed across a French field with a single fatal word: fire. SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Knoechlein stood accused of war crimes, specifically the unlawful execution of 97 surrendered British prisoners of war. The evidence was overwhelming. Survivor testimonies, eyewitness accounts from French civilians, and records from within the SS itself. Pooley and O'Callaghan both testified, recounting the terror of that day with chilling detail. But Knoechlein offered no remorse. His defense? "I was only following orders." Those 5 words would echo again and again throughout the post-war world. They became the hollow chorus of 1,000 war criminals attempting to escape moral responsibility. But the court didn't accept it. On January 21, 1949, Fritz Knoechlein was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging later that year. The shadows of Nuremberg, the trial of Fritz Knoechlein, was not isolated. It was part of a broader reckoning. At the Nuremberg trials, top Nazi officials, including SS commanders, were tried for crimes against humanity. The SS, as an organization, was declared criminal, its legacy forever tied to genocide, terror, and tyranny. Le Paradis became a grim example in military ethics discussions. It showed, with brutal clarity, what happens when ideology replaces conscience, when obedience outweighs humanity. A field of blood now a place of memory. Today, the field where the massacre occurred is no longer just grass and wind. A memorial wall now stands where the brick wall once soaked in blood. Plaques bear the names of the 97 men who were executed, young sons, brothers, husbands, cut down not in battle, but in betrayal. Each year, their families return. They come from across Britain. Many never knew the men personally, but they carry their names, their stories, and their pain. Flowers are laid. Silence is observed. The breeze still whispers through the wheat, but now it carries remembrance. One veteran once said, "We don't come here just to mourn the dead. We come here to remind the living." A lesson carved in stone. To this day, the massacre of Le Paradis is taught in British military schools, not as a lesson in tactics, but as a moral imperative. New generations of soldiers are shown the consequences of blind obedience. They are taught that there is a line that must never be crossed, even in war. Because when law disappears, when humanity is discarded, the uniform becomes a mask, and the man behind it can become a monster. This story began in a quiet French village, a place with a name that promised peace, Le Paradis. But by the end of May 27th, 1940, that paradise had been transformed into a blood-soaked field, where honor and humanity were stripped away by the crack of gunfire and the cold efficiency of evil. We followed the path of a man, Fritz Knoechlein, once a soldier, then an SS officer, and finally a condemned war criminal, a man who claimed obedience, but whose choices revealed complicity. We heard the voices of the two men who survived, Pooley and O'Callaghan, who crawled from the dead to speak for the silent 97 who never returned home. Their story became an indictment not just of one man or one unit, but of an entire ideology that allowed brutality to flourish under the mask of duty. But what if this wasn't the only Le Paradis? How many other fields like this one, scattered across Europe, hidden by forests, or buried beneath modern cities, witnessed horrors that were never documented, never punished, never even known? How many stories died with the victims? How many perpetrators slipped quietly into post-war life, unnoticed, unjudged? A question for you, the viewer. History often makes it easy to draw lines, hero and villain, right and wrong. But what if you had worn the black uniform of the SS? What if you had stood in that field, ordered to open fire? Would you have disobeyed? Would you have resisted? Would you have dared to choose conscience over command? We like to believe we would. But history tells us most people didn't. So ask yourself, is loyalty a virtue if it serves evil? And where exactly does obedience end and responsibility begin? But is that truly the end? We've walked through tragedy. We've uncovered injustice. We've honored memory. But still, the question lingers, uneasy, unfinished. But is that truly the whole story?